The press briefing room was already buzzing with anticipation as reporters filled the rows, setting up cameras, adjusting their microphones, and flipping through their notes. The usual chatter filled the air, a mixture of murmured conversations and the occasional clicking of keyboards as journalists prepared to capture every word that would be spoken. At the podium, Karoline Leavitt stood poised, her expression calm and professional as she adjusted the microphone slightly. She had done this countless times before, fielding tough questions, steering conversations, and maintaining control of the room. But there was something different about today. There was an undercurrent of tension, an almost unspoken awareness that this press conference would not proceed without confrontation. She glanced around the room, making a mental note of the familiar faces in the crowd. Seasoned political reporters, television correspondents, and the more aggressive journalists known for trying to create viral moments rather than report news. Karoline knew how this worked. She knew which reporters would ask legitimate policy questions and which ones would try to turn the press conference into a spectacle. Staying in control was the key. With a small inhale, she straightened her posture and spoke, her voice steady and authoritative. "Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started." Immediately, hands shot up across the room, a familiar frenzy of reporters vying for her attention. She nodded toward a senior journalist from a major news network who asked a measured question about the administration's latest policy initiative. Karoline responded smoothly, outlining the key points with clarity and reinforcing the administration's position. Another question followed about healthcare reform, then one about economic policy, and Karoline handled each one with precision, keeping the briefing focused, structured, and free of unnecessary drama. But then, the shift happened. A voice cut through the routine back and forth, sharp, pointed, and unmistakably laced with challenge. "Miss Leavitt, let's talk about the real issue here," the journalist said, her tone already signaling that this wasn't going to be a standard inquiry. The room seemed to pause slightly, the atmosphere tightening as heads turned toward the source of the voice. Karoline recognized her immediately, a journalist with a reputation for aggressive questioning and an agenda that went beyond simple reporting. Karoline remained composed, giving a small nod. "Go ahead," she said, already anticipating the loaded question that was coming next. The journalist smirked slightly, sensing an opportunity. The press conference had just shifted from policy discussion to confrontation, and everyone in the room knew it. The moment the journalist spoke again, it was clear she wasn't interested in policy discussions or meaningful debate. This was about spectacle. Leaning forward slightly, her voice carried a sharpness designed to cut through the routine press conference. "Ms. Leavitt," she began, her smirk barely concealed, "is it true that this administration's policies are intentionally harming marginalized communities? Because the data suggests otherwise." The words were calculated, a deliberate attempt to force Karoline into either a defensive stance or an outright denial that could be spun into controversy. The press room tensed slightly, reporters exchanging glances, recognizing the familiar game that was about to unfold. Cameras zoomed in, catching every movement, every pause, every flicker of expression. Karoline didn't blink. She knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't a legitimate inquiry. It was a trap, designed to provoke, to create a viral moment, to push her into either admitting a fabricated wrongdoing or appearing dismissive. She inhaled, her expression controlled. "I've answered this question before," she said, smoothly, keeping her tone even but firm. "This administration is focused on policies that benefit all Americans, regardless of background. If you'd like to discuss today's topic, I'm happy to continue." But the journalist wasn't done. She leaned in further, her body language signaling aggression, her pen tapping against her notepad in a rhythmic, almost taunting manner. "You didn't actually answer the question," she pressed, her voice carrying a practiced edge of skepticism. "Can you directly address whether these policies disproportionately harm marginalized communities?" She was baiting Karoline, waiting for a reaction, waiting for her to slip. Karoline exhaled slowly, her grip on the podium steady. She wasn't going to fall for it. "I did answer," she said evenly. "I just didn't answer it in the way you wanted." The response sent a ripple through the room, a subtle acknowledgement that Karoline was not playing by the journalist's script. Some reporters raised their eyebrows slightly, impressed by the composure. Others smirked, recognizing that this exchange was no longer about information, it was about control. The journalist, sensing that she was losing her grip on the moment, escalated. "So? You're avoiding a direct answer," she challenged, her voice just a notch louder, ensuring that her microphone picked up every word perfectly. The tension thickened. More reporters stopped taking notes and started watching. The cameras adjusted their angles. This was no longer a question, it was a performance. Karoline saw it for what it was. "I'm not avoiding anything," she responded, her voice measured but unshakable. "I'm ensuring that this briefing remains focused on real discussions, not theatrics." Another ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Even some of the reporters who had initially been indifferent were now seeing the moment shift. Karoline wasn't just answering questions. She was pushing back against the manipulation. But the journalist wasn't giving up. "So, just to be clear," she said, her smirk returning, "that's a no comment?" She had framed it perfectly for the cameras, giving them a soundbite that could be taken out of context, edited and replayed over and over. Karoline wasn't falling for it. "I've made my position clear," she stated, without giving the journalist the clip she wanted. The moment stretched for a few seconds, the weight of the exchange hanging in the air, and then, in a decisive move, Karoline shifted her gaze away from the journalist and pointed to another reporter. "Next question," she said firmly. She had just taken control back. The journalist's smirk barely wavered, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. Frustration. She had expected Karoline Leavitt to stumble, to become flustered, or to at least waver under the mounting pressure. But Karoline wasn't playing along. Instead of letting the moment spiral into the controversy the journalist clearly wanted, she had shut it down with a calm but decisive response. The power struggle was clear now. This wasn't about information, it was about who controlled the room. The silence stretched for just a beat too long, making the exchange feel even more weighty, as if the entire press corps was collectively waiting to see what would happen next. Karoline didn't flinch. She kept her expression steady, her hands still lightly resting on the podium, her posture unwavering. The journalist, however, was not ready to concede. She leaned forward again, doubling down. "Miss Leavitt, I just don't see why it's so hard to answer a simple yes or no question," she pushed, her voice carrying a practiced tone of feigned exasperation. "Are these policies disproportionately harming marginalized communities, yes or no?" The air in the room shifted, tightening like a wire being pulled taut. Karoline could feel the weight of the cameras, the journalists mentally crafting their headlines, the anticipation of the next soundbite. This was precisely what the journalist wanted. To back her into a corner, to force her into a binary answer that could be weaponized against her later. If Karoline said yes, it would be a scandal. If she said no, it would be framed as dismissive. It was a deliberate trap. Karoline exhaled quietly, then spoke with measured control. "I'm not here to provide sound bites for headlines," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here to engage in meaningful discussion. If you have a policy question, I'm happy to answer it. But I'm not going to participate in a game designed for viral clips rather than real dialogue." A murmur spread through the room. Some journalists nodded slightly, recognizing that Karoline had just diffused the moment without backing down. Others kept their eyes on their notes, sensing that this had become a battle of persistence rather than a real inquiry. The journalist, now visibly annoyed, tried one last time. "So, just to be clear," she said, her pen tapping against her notepad. "You're refusing to answer?" Karoline met her gaze directly, her composure intact. "I've already answered," she said simply. "You just don't like the answer." Another murmur of approval rippled through the room. This time, not just from conservative-leaning reporters, but from those who understood that there was a difference between pressing for transparency and trying to manufacture controversy. The journalist's expression shifted slightly, the realization settling in that she wasn't going to get the viral moment she had been pushing for. She hesitated, as if considering another route, but by now the energy in the room had already moved on. Karoline took that opportunity, redirecting the conversation entirely. She looked away from the journalist, scanning the room, then pointed to another reporter. "Next question," she said evenly, and just like that, she had won the moment. The tension in the press briefing room didn't ease. It only thickened, stretching out like a rope pulled taut between two forces unwilling to back down. Karoline Leavitt had made it clear that she wasn't going to engage in performative theatrics, but the journalist wasn't willing to let the moment slip through her fingers so easily. She had failed to trap Karoline into a damaging soundbite, but there was still an opportunity. To push further, to escalate, to make the confrontation itself the story. And so, instead of moving on, she leaned in, doubling down. "Ms. Leavitt," she said, her voice sharper now, the practiced calm beginning to crack, "you keep saying you've answered, but the American people deserve a straightforward response. So I'll ask again. Yes or no, do these policies disproportionately harm marginalized communities?" It wasn't about the answer anymore. It was about control. The camera zoomed in, catching every micro-expression, every breath, every flicker of movement between the two women at the center of the unfolding drama. Reporters shifted slightly in their seats, sensing that this was no longer a normal press briefing. This was turning into a defining moment. Karoline exhaled steadily, refusing to let the weight of the moment shift onto her shoulders. She had played this game before and she knew the rules. The journalist wanted her to snap, to falter, to let frustration seep into her voice. But Karoline wouldn't give her that victory. She stayed composed. She stayed in control. "I've already answered your question," she said, her voice unwavering. "I understand that you don't like the answer, but that doesn't change the fact that I've given it." The journalist let out a quiet, exaggerated laugh, shaking her head, as if to signal to the room that Karoline was the unreasonable one. "So that's it?" she pressed, raising her eyebrows. "You're just refusing to engage in transparency?" There it was. The framing she wanted. It didn't matter how many times Karoline had answered. The goal was to push the narrative that she was being evasive. The optics mattered more than the truth, and the journalist knew it. Karoline saw it too, and she wasn't having it. "I'm refusing to turn this press briefing into a personal performance for you," she countered, her tone still steady but carrying just enough authority to remind everyone who was actually running the room. Transparency means answering legitimate questions, not indulging bad faith arguments meant for viral moments. A low murmur spread across the room. Some reporters scribbled furiously, realizing that Karoline had just flipped the entire exchange on its head. Others shifted uncomfortably, aware that the confrontation had stopped being about policy long ago and had turned into something else entirely. The journalist, still determined to salvage her viral moment, played her final card. She let silence fill the space, making it seem as if Karoline had left an empty void where a real answer should be. Then, with deliberate timing, she said, loud enough for every microphone to catch it, "Wow, so much for press freedom." That was it. That was the headline she wanted. The room reacted instantly, not with cheers or gasps, but with the kind of quiet, waiting energy that signaled something was about to shift even further. A few reporters glanced toward one another, while the security personnel standing at the edge of the room straightened slightly, sensing where this might be headed. Karoline inhaled slowly, her grip on the podium tightening just slightly, not out of frustration, but out of strategic calculation. The journalist was trying to push her beyond her limits, hoping she would snap, retaliate, or shut down the conversation in a way that could be framed as authoritarian. Instead, Karoline did the opposite. She let the silence linger just long enough for the weight of the moment to sink in. Then she tilted her head slightly, offering the faintest smile, one not of amusement but of recognition. "You're free to ask real questions," she said smoothly, her voice calm but firm, a masterclass in controlled power. "But if you'd rather make a statement, I suggest you take it to an editorial column. Next question." The shift was instant. She had taken back control. The journalist opened her mouth to push again, but Karoline had already turned her attention elsewhere, and just like that, the confrontation was over. But the storm that would follow, that was just beginning. The moment Karoline Leavitt shifted her attention away from the journalist, it was clear that the confrontation was over, or at least it should have been, but the journalist wasn't ready to let go. She let out a dramatic exhale, shook her head slightly, and muttered just loud enough for the cameras to catch it, So much for transparency. It was the final push, the last desperate attempt to claw back control of the moment. But it wasn't just about the words. It was about optics. She knew the cameras were still locked onto her, capturing every move, every subtle expression. The moment she had been angling for, the viral soundbite, the narrative of being silenced, was slipping away, and she was determined to drag it back into her grasp. She straightened in her seat, arms crossed, refusing to be dismissed. "I think the American people deserve better than this," she said, her voice louder now, forcing herself back into the moment. Other reporters glanced around, some uncomfortable with how the press conference was devolving, others intrigued, sensing that this was no longer about questions and answers. This was a confrontation with no clear exit. The tension in the room thickened, and Karoline could feel it. She had handled plenty of difficult questions before, had diffused countless media traps, but this was something different. A subtle shift at the edge of the room caught her attention. Security personnel had straightened, now fully alert, reading the energy in the space. They weren't moving in yet, but they were watching, waiting. The journalist was pushing, testing boundaries, seeing how far she could go before someone intervened. This wasn't about getting an answer anymore. This was about making a scene. Karoline exhaled slowly, keeping her posture steady. She wasn't going to be the one to escalate. But that didn't mean she would tolerate the room being hijacked. She turned back toward the journalist, her tone even but firm. "If you'd like to stay and listen to the rest of the press conference, you're welcome to," she said. "But if you continue interrupting and disrupting, we'll have to move on without you." A beat of silence, then the journalist scoffed, shaking her head again for dramatic effect. "Unbelievable," she muttered. That was enough. Karoline didn't need to say another word. She glanced once toward security, and that slight, unspoken signal was all it took. One of the officers took a single step forward, not aggressive, not forceful, just a quiet assertion of presence. The message was clear. Enough. The journalist saw it. She hesitated, realizing she had pushed as far as she could go. For a moment, it seemed like she might refuse to back down, might force security to physically remove her, which would have been exactly the viral moment she was looking for. But then, slowly, she picked up her notepad, adjusted the strap of her bag, and stood up. She didn't leave without one last remark, spoken just loud enough for the microphones to catch. "You can kick me out," she said, glancing back toward Karoline, "but you can't silence the truth." And with that, she walked toward the door, securing the narrative she had wanted all along. The press room remained silent for a long moment after she left, the weight of the confrontation lingering in the air. Then, finally, a new hand went up. The press conference continued, but Karoline knew that outside this room, the real battle had just begun. As the journalist walked toward the exit, the air in the press briefing room remained thick with tension. Every camera in the room tracked her movement, capturing the exact moment she left, not forcibly, not dragged out by security, but walking out on her own terms. And yet, the narrative was already being shaped in real time. The soundbite she had left behind, "You can kick me out, but you can't silence the truth," was designed to be clipped, replayed, and taken out of context to fit a larger story that had nothing to do with what had actually happened. Karoline Leavitt knew it, the press knew it, and the journalists certainly knew it. For a brief moment, the room sat in silence, as if everyone was waiting to see what Karoline would do next. Would she address the incident? Would she let it pass and move on? Would she give the media another moment to dissect? Karoline understood the stakes. Every decision in that room would dictate how the moment played out outside of it. So, instead of reacting emotionally, she did exactly what she had planned from the beginning. She stayed in control. She adjusted the microphone slightly, exhaled calmly, and then, without acknowledging the drama, she pointed to another journalist. "Next question." The shift was immediate. Some reporters, clearly rattled by what had just happened, hesitated before jumping back into the actual policy discussions. Others, particularly those looking for another viral moment, were disappointed that Karoline wasn't taking the bait. But that was the difference between a professional handling of a situation and an orchestrated media stunt. Still, the damage was already done. Or at least, the battle had shifted to another front. The moment the journalist stepped out of that briefing room, her real work had begun. Within minutes, she was seated for a live interview on a major news network, retelling the events in her own words. "I was simply doing my job," she said, her voice carrying the perfect level of controlled indignation, her posture slightly slouched, as if to convey exhaustion from being targeted. "I asked fair but tough questions, and instead of answers, I was met with hostility." The framing was deliberate. She wasn't a journalist who had disrupted an entire press conference and ignored repeated warnings. She was a victim of an administration afraid of scrutiny, and the networks ran with it. Headlines flashed across television screens and social media within minutes. Press secretary shuts down reporter for asking hard questions. Journalist removed for challenging Leavitt. And attack on press freedom unfolds at White House. Karoline, however, had expected all of this. She had seen these tactics before. And that's why, even as the false narrative spread, she remained focused on the long game. While the journalist was making the rounds on television, painting herself as a crusader for truth, Karoline's team was already executing the next step, releasing the full, unedited footage. Because in the end, facts would always outweigh theatrics. The moment the journalist stepped out of the press briefing room, the firestorm began. Within minutes, headlines flooded news websites, social media exploded with reactions, and television networks interrupted their regular programming to cover what had just transpired. The narrative had already been crafted before the facts even had a chance to settle. Major outlets framed it as a direct attack on press freedom, running with bold, sensationalized headlines like, "Journalist removed for asking tough questions. Leavitt silences the press. An administration censors media inquiry in unprecedented move." It didn't matter that the journalist had repeatedly disrupted the press conference, ignored warnings, and attempted to hijack the moment. What mattered was the perception. Social media was even worse. Trending hashtags formed within minutes. Silencing the press, Leavitt dodges questions, and free speech under attack flooded Twitter, with thousands of users instantly taking sides. Liberal commentators and activists latched onto the story, calling it a chilling example of government censorship. "This is how authoritarianism begins," one well-known media personality tweeted, garnering tens of thousands of likes and retweets. Others declared the incident a violation of democracy, warning that if reporters could be removed from press briefings, then free speech was under direct assault. The message was clear. Karoline Leavitt had become the villain in their narrative. But while mainstream media painted a one-sided story, conservative voices fought back just as aggressively. Within hours, right-leaning networks and political commentators aired the full, unedited footage, exposing the truth that had been conveniently omitted from the initial coverage. "Watch for yourself," one anchor declared on air. "Does this look like a journalist being silenced? Or does it look like someone disrupting a press conference to create a viral moment?" The footage showed everything: the repeated interruptions, the refusal to let other reporters ask questions, and most importantly, the fact that the journalist had walked out voluntarily. On Twitter and Facebook, the counter-narrative gained traction. Memes flooded in, mocking the journalist's dramatic exit with captions like, "Not silenced, just disruptive," and "When your performance flops but you still try to go viral." Karoline's supporters called out the hypocrisy of the mainstream media, pointing out how they had conveniently ignored the full sequence of events. Some even accused the journalist of intentionally orchestrating the incident to boost her own career. Meanwhile, Karoline and her team remained calm. They had anticipated this exact response, and they were prepared. While networks debated the incident, while social media raged, while the journalist made her rounds on television claiming victimhood, Karoline's team executed the next strategic move, controlling the narrative. The full, unedited footage was posted on every official platform, captioned simply, "Watch for yourself." No added commentary, no spin, just the raw, undeniable truth. The moment it went live, the narrative began to shift. Because in the battle of perception, VI's reality, Karoline knew that the truth, once revealed, would always cut through the noise. Karoline Leavitt knew that in modern politics and media, perception was everything. It didn't matter what had actually happened in that press briefing room. What mattered was who controlled the narrative first. The journalist had crafted her own version of the story before she had even left the building, and the media had eagerly latched onto it. Within minutes, the headlines, the tweets, and the outraged pundits had set the tone. But Karoline wasn't about to let them run unchecked. She understood the game, and she was already moving on the counterattack. Her team had been monitoring the reaction in real time, watching as social media flared up, as networks lined up their talking points, as the journalists' interviews painted her as a brave truth seeker who had been removed for asking hard questions. It was predictable, almost scripted. Karoline had seen these tactics before, and she knew exactly how to dismantle them. She called a meeting with her senior advisors immediately. First step, we release the full video, no edits, no commentary, just the raw exchange. She turned to her communications director, her voice steady but sharp. I don't want flashy graphics or spin, just the facts. Let the American people see what actually happened. Within minutes, the full uncut footage was posted across official government platforms, captioned simply, "Watch the full exchange for yourself." It was a powerful move. Instead of reacting emotionally, instead of engaging in a back and forth, Karoline let the truth speak for itself. The moment it went live, the shift began to take effect. Conservative media immediately seized on the footage. Right-heating news outlets began running segments, comparing the full exchange to the selectively framed reports that had come out in the initial media frenzy. The mainstream media told you she was silenced. The footage shows the truth. She was disrupting a press conference and refused to let others ask questions. Anchors broke down the video moment by moment, exposing the journalist's performance for what it was: a staged provocation designed to generate clicks and outrage. Meanwhile, Karoline moved to the next step of her strategy. Getting ahead of the media cycle before the distorted version of events became cemented. She sat down for an exclusive interview that evening with one of the most influential conservative anchors, ensuring that her side of the story reached millions of viewers in prime time. This was never about silencing the press, she said firmly, looking straight into the camera. This was about keeping a press briefing from being hijacked by someone looking for a viral moment. We believe in transparency. That's why we posted the full video for the American people to judge for themselves. Her message was clear, confident, and direct. No defensive stance, no apology, no wavering. She wasn't going to let the left-wing media control the discussion. By the time the interview aired, the public perception had already begun to shift. Social media conversations became divided, not overwhelmingly in favor of the journalist as they had been at first, but now questioning whether she had staged the entire moment for attention. People who had seen the unedited video began calling out mainstream outlets for misleading coverage. Her next move was even smarter, bringing in third-party voices to reinforce the truth. Within hours, prominent political figures, journalists, and media analysts were dissecting the event. A respected veteran reporter known for his balanced views wrote a scathing op-ed. This was not a journalist seeking answers. This was a calculated disruption meant to create controversy. That piece alone began shifting opinions among moderates, proving that Karoline's strategy was working. By the next morning, major media outlets that had initially championed the journalist were quietly adjusting their language. The original narrative, that Karoline had removed a journalist for doing her job, was now being softened. Headlines subtly changed. Some networks aired brief corrections, acknowledging that the journalist had refused to yield the floor despite repeated warnings. It wasn't an outright admission of bias, but it was the closest thing to a retreat Karoline could have expected. By controlling the timeline, releasing the uncut footage immediately, and forcing the media to confront the reality of what had actually transpired, Karoline had successfully flipped the script. The journalist had tried to turn herself into a martyr for free speech, but in the end, she had only exposed how the media manipulates public perception for their own gain. Karoline leaned back in her chair, her phone lighting up with notifications. The storm wasn't over, but she had won this round. The media had tried to frame the story against her, but now they were playing defense, and in the world of political strategy, that meant Karoline was in control. The media's reaction to the release of the full unedited video was swift, but not uniform. The moment Karoline Leavitt's team posted the complete footage, the original narrative of press suppression began to fracture. Within hours, the contrast between what was initially reported and what was actually shown in the full exchange became undeniable. But instead of acknowledging their mistake outright, Mainstream media outlets scrambled to reshape their messaging, attempting to salvage the credibility of their original coverage while also avoiding direct confrontation with the truth. Left-leaning networks struggled to maintain their initial outrage. The journalist who had painted herself as a victim of government censorship suddenly faced a credibility crisis. Networks that had run with "Leavitt silences the press" headlines now had to reckon with a growing public backlash. CNN and MSNBC carefully adjusted their framing, subtly shifting from claims of outright press suppression to a broader discussion about press relations and the administration's approach to challenging questions. Instead of directly addressing the misleading nature of their earlier reporting, they pivoted, choosing to discuss whether this administration had a pattern of avoiding tough scrutiny rather than focusing on the reality of the situation. Meanwhile, conservative media wasted no time in exposing the discrepancies. Fox News, The Daily Wire, and independent commentators aired side-by-side comparisons of the original misleading reports versus the full, uncut video. "This is what they told you happened," one primetime anchor said, showing the selectively edited clips where the journalist appeared to be unfairly dismissed. "And here's what actually happened," he continued, rolling the footage of her repeated interruptions, refusal to yield, and attempts to dominate the briefing. The footage spoke for itself, and as more people watched, the outrage began to shift, not toward Karoline Leavitt, but toward the media outlets that had deliberately omitted the full context. On social media, the backlash against the original reporting intensified. Viewers who had initially believed the journalist's version of events began calling out major networks for manipulating the truth. Twitter threads exposed how key moments had been edited out in early reports, showing how a narrative had been carefully curated. "We were lied to," one viral post read, showing timestamps of how networks had cut the briefing to remove Karoline's reasonable responses and frame her as dismissive. Another post compared the journalist's post-briefing interviews to the full footage, noting how her recounting of the event completely contradicted the raw video. Faced with mounting public scrutiny, some mainstream journalists began to backtrack. While the networks themselves avoided issuing formal corrections, several well-known media figures admitted that the situation had been misrepresented. One respected political correspondent tweeted, "After reviewing the full footage, I have to say, this was not press suppression. It was a journalist refusing to follow standard press briefing procedures. That's not censorship, that's order." Another wrote an op-ed titled, "This is why people don't trust the media," in which he criticized his own colleagues for prioritizing a viral moment over honest reporting. However, not all media outlets were willing to acknowledge the truth. Some doubled down, claiming that the full footage did not change the fundamental issue, that the administration had created a hostile environment for the press. Instead of admitting that the journalist had been disruptive, these networks reframed the conversation, shifting from the specifics of the incident to a broader discussion about whether government officials should be more welcoming of tough, aggressive questions. One panel discussion on MSNBC debated whether Karoline's firm response had a chilling effect on future journalists, subtly reinforcing the idea that even if this journalist had gone too far, the real issue was a government unwilling to embrace pushback. But Karoline's strategy had already succeeded. The conversation was no longer about whether she had acted inappropriately, but rather about media ethics and whether the press was playing fair. By forcing news outlets to respond to the full video, she had put them on defense, shifting the focus from herself to the credibility of the networks that had misrepresented the story. By the next day, the media split was clear. Conservative outlets hailed Karoline's handling of the situation as a win against media manipulation, while liberal-leaning networks carefully distanced themselves from the journalist's initial claims without admitting fault. Some reporters began quietly deleting tweets that had originally framed the story as a press freedom issue, recognizing that the truth had dismantled their preferred narrative. Karoline, watching all of this unfold, knew she had won the battle of perception. The journalist had wanted a viral moment, but instead she had exposed exactly why public trust in the media was at an all-time low. The mainstream press had tried to shape a story, but they underestimated the power of raw, unfiltered truth, and now they were paying the price. As the media frenzy surrounding the press briefing began to settle, a much bigger question emerged. One that extended far beyond Karoline Leavitt, the removed journalist, or even the administration itself. This wasn't just about a heated exchange at a press conference, or about whether a journalist had been removed fairly. It was about the media's role in shaping narratives, the erosion of public trust, and whether the press was truly serving the people, or serving itself. The real story was no longer about who had won the confrontation, but rather about why this situation had played out the way it did, and what it revealed about the state of modern journalism. The full, unedited footage had exposed a harsh reality. Many media outlets had been willing to manipulate the story to fit a predetermined narrative. Instead of reporting on the facts, they had carefully framed the incident to stir outrage, relying on selective clips, dramatic headlines, and a journalist's carefully crafted victimhood. And it had worked. At least at first. The initial wave of headlines and social media reactions had been overwhelmingly in favor of the journalist, painting her as a symbol of press suppression. But when the full video emerged, the cracks in that story became impossible to ignore. This led to an uncomfortable question that even some in the media had to confront. If so many people had been willing to run with a distorted version of events without verifying the full story, how often did this happen? How many times had public opinion been steered by half-truths and selective reporting simply because it fit a convenient narrative? And more importantly, how much of the trust the media had lost over the past decade was self-inflicted? For years, trust in mainstream media had been in decline, with more Americans on both sides of the political spectrum questioning whether they were receiving fair, objective news. Incidents like this only reinforced that skepticism. The fact that some networks had doubled down even after the truth came out suggested that for many in the press, winning the narrative war was more important than reporting the facts. And if that was the case, what did it mean for the future of journalism? Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt had not just survived the controversy, she had turned it into an opportunity. By remaining composed, refusing to be baited, and controlling the post-event messaging, she had exposed a much larger issue. It wasn't just about one journalist who had pushed too far. It was about a system that thrived on manufactured outrage. And by releasing the full footage and letting the public judge for themselves, Karoline had done something rare in politics. She had put the truth ahead of the spin. But was the public even willing to accept the truth anymore? That was the bigger question. Even after the full video had dismantled the original claims of press suppression, there were still millions of people who would only see the initial headlines, the outrage tweets, the selectively edited clips. Many wouldn't bother to watch the full footage or question whether they had been misled, and that raised an unsettling reality about modern information consumption. In an era of instant outrage and short attention spans, did the truth still have power? Or had it become just another voice in an endless sea of competing narratives? This wasn't just a problem for Karoline, or for conservatives, or even for this administration. It was a problem for society as a whole. If people no longer trusted the media, but also didn't take the time to verify facts for themselves, what did that mean for the future of democracy? Was truth something that could even be agreed upon anymore? Or had we entered an age where reality itself was subjective, where whoever shouted the loudest, or had the most influence, could determine what? As the dust settled, one thing was certain. This wasn't the last time a story would be manipulated, a narrative would be framed, or the truth would be put to the test. The media machine would continue moving, looking for the next controversy, the next viral moment, the next battle for public perception. And those in power, whether politicians, journalists, or media executives, would continue playing the game, knowing that in the end, perception had become more powerful than reality. For Karoline Leavitt, this had been a victory, but she understood the deeper implications. This wasn't just about one press briefing, one journalist, or one administration. It was about the larger war being fought every day, the war for truth in an era where information was both more accessible and more distorted than ever before. And that war, she knew, was far from over. In today's world, where information spreads faster than ever, one of the most valuable lessons we can take from this story is the importance of discernment and critical thinking. We live in an era where news is not just reported. It is shaped, framed, and sometimes manipulated to fit a particular narrative. For many seniors who have spent decades witnessing political and social changes, this shift in the media landscape can be unsettling. Gone are the days when the news could be trusted at face value. Now, it is our responsibility to question, verify, and think for ourselves. One key takeaway from this situation is that not everything we see or hear is the full story. Headlines are designed to grab attention, and social media thrives on controversy. It is easy to react emotionally to a story before all the facts come out, but as we saw in this case, the first version of events is not always the most accurate. A story can be twisted by selective editing, misleading wording, or even omission of key details. This reminds us of an old wisdom: believe nothing you hear and only half of what you see. In our fast-moving digital age, this is more relevant than ever. Another lesson is the power of staying calm and composed under pressure. Karoline Leavitt faced an intense situation, one designed to provoke a reaction. Instead of lashing out, she maintained control, refused to be baited, and ultimately let the truth speak for itself. There is great strength in composure, patience, and the ability to stand firm without being reactionary. This is something we can apply in our own lives, whether in personal relationships, family disagreements, or encounters with misinformation. The ability to respond thoughtfully instead of reacting emotionally is a skill that can bring clarity and wisdom to any situation. Finally, this situation highlights the importance of personal responsibility in consuming information. It is easy to blame the media or politicians for the spread of misinformation, but we as individuals have a role to play as well. We must make an effort to seek out full stories, consider multiple perspectives, and not jump to conclusions based on emotion alone. For seniors, who often serve as the pillars of wisdom in their families and communities, this is especially crucial. By setting an example of patience, thoughtfulness, and discernment, you can help guide younger generations toward a more informed and balanced way of thinking. At the end of the day, the lesson is simple but profound. Truth still matters, but it requires effort to find it. And in a world of noise and distraction, those who seek truth with patience and wisdom will always have an advantage.